7, Section 1. Now, the big idea here is that the Constitution gives the executive branch the power to execute or to implement the law. So Congress makes the laws, Supreme Court reviews the laws, but this is the branch whose responsibility it is to make sure that those laws get followed. So we saw the failure of the Articles of Confederation because there was no president. Daniel Shays was able to rebel against a federal law, and there was no national government to put it down. It was up to that state to put it down. That's a failure. And then immediately after the signing of the Constitution, you have the Whiskey Rebellion, where there was a president, George Washington, who actually led an army into Pennsylvania to put down that rebellion. And so, the key difference there is it was a federal solution to a federal problem instead of a local solution to a national problem, because there was no federal government. So that's the Constitution, and that's what it gives the ability to do. And so this question, the Electoral College. There's a lot of confusion around what the Electoral College does and what its original purpose was. Some people say it's a states' rights thing. Some people say it's a distrust of the people. And so we'll get into kind of what the Electoral College is, and then I'm going to leave it up to you to think about, is this still a relevant method in selecting a president? So again, there's a whole chapter coming up soon about that, but for now I just want to kind of leave that question there. So the first part here is we're talking about the office of the president, and I just want to lay out what the president does and why it really is one of the most important offices, not just in this country, but really in the world. So first off, what do you have to be a president? Well, the president of the United States is not just the executive of our country, not just the boss. They actually are an entire branch of the United States government. This is the philosophy that the Secret Service works off of when they agree to jump in front of bullets and die for this individual, because they're dying not just for an individual, they're representing an entire third of our United States government. This is why this person is bigger than just a person. And so they're elected every 4 years, and this election is the only one that takes place across the entire country. So that means from Alaska to Hawaii to Florida to our soldiers stationed overseas vote via absentee ballot. People around the world who are American citizens vote and participate in this election. It's the only one like that. So, what do they need? Wow, right? At least 35 years old. Okay, yay, I just qualified. Native-born American citizen. This one has been somewhat controversial, and you never know, in our lifetime this may change. In fact, Arnold Schwarzenegger courted the idea publicly of running for president once upon a time. He may still. And for him to be eligible to run, this part of the Constitution would have to change because he was born elsewhere. I think he was born in Austria. But you must be a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. So we do have many American citizens who live abroad, who are non-resident citizens of the United States. You could go live and, I've wondered about retiring in another country because, as I've gotten to travel, I've seen, hey, this is not the only great place to live. I would question, do I keep my citizenship? Do I begin the process of, and if I were residing in another country for over 14 years, well, I couldn't go back and run for president. The president get elected. This is where it gets a little confusing. Get the Electoral College, which is a group of people named by each state legislature to select the president and the vice president. And so when we meet our General Assembly representatives, State Senator Edwards is probably going to be the first one to come and talk. This is a good question for him. Who did you pick to be a part of the Electoral College for the state of North Carolina, and why? And in your opinion, how is this still part of the democratic process? So, just in understanding the Electoral College, these are a group of people who are appointed by your state legislatures. You don't pick them, they pick them. So, that's the Electoral College. Now, what do? They are electors. Electors, that is a person appointed to vote in the presidential elections for the major candidates. So, you are, throughout the democratic process, picking Edwards, who picks the electors. Now, who do they vote for? Well, number one, how many of these there are in each state is determined by how many congressional seats North Carolina has. So our census will be conducted, the nationwide census will be conducted in the summer of 2020. And so every 10 years we figure out, to the best of our ability, and a lot of money is expended on this, how many people are in this country. We need to know. And we need to know, are there fewer people in North Carolina than 2010, or are there more people in North Carolina than 2010? Because depending on if we got more or less, that means more or less congressional seats, more people like Meadows. And if there's more people like Meadows, there's also more electoral votes, which means we have more say in who becomes the next president. Now, who do these electors vote for? They do not have the right to vote for whoever they choose, because that's not democracy. That's not how this system was set up to work. They do not have the right to vote for whoever they choose. There was drama in 2016 about whether some of these electors would change their votes and become, quote, Hamilton electors. But just so you know, there are questions about that from time to time, but they are supposed to vote for who the state tells them to vote for. Now, let's just say theoretically there are 9 of these in North Carolina. I don't remember exactly, it changes every 10 years, but let's say in theory there are 9 of these. Now, here's where it gets confusing. If 51% of the voters in the state of North Carolina choose a candidate for president, all 9 of those votes go to that candidate. Does that make sense, guys? It's called a winner-take-all system. So as long as one candidate gets more votes than the others, that candidate gets all those votes. Because while it is a purely democratic process in the state of North Carolina, it is an electoral process for the nation. And this is part of that compromise worked out, who has the most power, the states or the population. Now, once we pick a president, that person serves for no more than 2 terms. However, we also know that has been fudged before. Franklin Delano Roosevelt served 3 terms as president, and he was elected for a 4th. And however, he passed away while in office. They actually do get a salary, and it's substantial. I mean, they do run the country. Annual salary of $400,000, and that's adjusted for inflation, so this number is probably dated. It's perhaps a little higher now. They get to live at the White House. It's awesome, by the way. I'm sure you've seen it in the movies and whatnot. I got to tour it last year with our DC trip. It's pretty incredible. It's beautiful. It's very modern, and it's also rather well defended. And there's also Camp David. It's the president's private retreat. Camp David is not just a weekend getaway. It's where the president hosts important dignitaries. This is a great sales tactic. International agreements have been brokered at Camp David. What's a better way to convince someone than to take them out in a beautiful place, show them a good time, and spend some quality one-on-one time talking to them and getting to know them. Because if you go to the White House, and the part you get to see on the tour is not like the cool part with the missiles, and I was kind of hoping for that sort of stuff. But no, you get to see like where the fancy dinners are and where the formal offices are. That's all really stuffy. I don't feel comfortable in places like that. Where I would feel comfortable making business agreements, Camp David. And then finally, of course, Air Force One. There's a great movie called Air Force One, by the way, with Harrison Ford. If you haven't seen it, you should. And it kind of highlights some of the defense mechanisms that this airplane possesses. Because, Air Force One serves the purpose of transporting the president. But also in the event of an emergency, if there's a threat to Washington, D.C., the president goes up in Air Force One. And it's always accompanied by fighter jets. It is a part of the branch of the United States Air Force. So anyway, those are some of the benefits that go along with the president. Now, vice president, also elected with the president. They run on the same ticket. So when you go to vote and you see your ballot for the first time, it would say, Trump, Pence, or whoever candidate and their running mate. So the vice president is elected along with the president. And it is the job of the vice president ultimately to become the president of the United States if, and both of these have happened before, if a president resigns while in office, Nixon did that, or if a president dies while in office. And of course, Lincoln and Kennedy were both shot and killed while in office. And in both cases, their vice president assumed office. Now, the president also presides over the Senate, where he or she votes to break a tie, if there were to be a tie. Because there are, no matter what the population is, there are only 2 U.S. senators, period. Only 2 U.S. senators in each state. And that means that, run the numbers, there can be a tie. And guess what? There have been ties. And it is the job of the vice president to cast the tie-breaking vote. And sometimes they vote anyway, just symbolically. They want their name on the record associated with a certain law. And so Pence has done that. He's also broken ties. But yeah. Now the next question, why is the Electoral College used to determine the winner in presidential elections? Because once more, even explaining this, I understand that it can be confusing and it can be just a little frustrating when you're thinking about, wait, I get to pick the president. Wait, no, I picked the electors who picked the president. Why is there that extra step? So let's get into that. Now, what happens if the president dies and then the vice president dies? And again, this is a scenario that we have to plan for, unfortunately. And so the Presidential Succession Act developed this. What if? Now again, so when Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford assumed office, he also picked a vice president, who I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but that's the point. So you have Nixon and then Ford, who would then pick a vice president. But what if all of them died at the same time? And Tom Clancy actually wrote a really good book about this called Executive Orders. So in his book, a terrorist attack killed the President of the United States and the Vice President and the Speaker of the House. and the president pro tempore of the Senate, and the Secretary of the State. And then the list goes on. And all of those people were killed. Again, it's science fiction. And there happened to be one freshman congressman who was homesick or visiting family or something. He was away, and he survived. And, of course, it was Jack Ryan, if you're familiar with the Tom Clancy novels. And so guess what? He gets to be president. And he's like, and then, throughout the book, he had to deal with this terrorist threat because of the Presidential Succession Act. We have to have a leader. Next, the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment states that if a president becomes incapable of governing, the vice president assumes. Now, this is not just if the president is shot. That one's obvious. When Ronald Reagan had to go under for surgery back in the 1980s, the vice president had to invoke the 25th Amendment. And granted, Reagan was only under for a matter of hours. But we still have to have a leader, even in that matter of hours. And this also names all the positions in line for presidency. So if you so desire, you can look up the 25th Amendment and go all the way down the list until you finally find that freshman congressman. It also gives the vice president a role in determining whether the president is unable to do the job. This is another one that, what if, most of the presidents that we pick are elderly. What if they began to display symptoms of dementia or mental illness? Well, that person might not recognize that in themselves. They might receive the diagnosis and disagree. They might feel that they are perfectly capable of making the decisions and serving in the office of president, whereas the vice president might disagree. And his advisors might approach him and say, Mr. Vice President, we feel that you need to evoke the 25th Amendment. And the vice president would have a role in determining that, and perhaps make the president step down. Now, historically, we call that a coup. But yet, this needs to be done in a peaceful way, which is why the Constitution would lay out ability. Now, do you think there should be another presidential election instead of having a vice president? So that's another question that's been asked is, when Lincoln died, Andrew Johnson, the vice president who assumed power, really made a mess of things and wound up getting impeached. And so there was the question of, should that be how it works? When Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford took over, he made a mess of things. Now, Lyndon Johnson went on to do a great job when he assumed the role for Kennedy, but there have been at least two or three, what is that guy's name? When William Henry Harrison died, his vice president assumed office, and I don't even remember his name, but they just called him the accident, or his accidency. And so there have been plenty of cases where, maybe we should rethink that.